Imagine moving into a new neighborhood, excited to start fresh, only to have your peace shattered by an overzealous neighbor. That's exactly what happened when HOA Karen called the cops on my wife, all because of something as trivial as a minor neighborhood rule. But here's the twist. My wife isn't just any ordinary woman. When Karen saw her military ID, she froze. What happened next completely flipped the power dynamic. Stick around. It's a story you're not going to want to miss. And if you enjoyed this one, be sure to click subscribe, because tomorrow, we have another special story for you. We'd finally done it. After months of house hunting, packing, and feeling like we were living out of cardboard boxes, we were finally here, our new home. You know that feeling when you walk into a new place, and it feels like the world is suddenly full of possibility. Yeah, that's how we felt. It was a fresh start, a clean slate. The kind of vibe you get when you move away from the chaos of city life and settle into a peaceful suburban neighborhood. The kind where people wave as they drive by, and lawns are pristine. The kind of place where you could finally have the white picket fence, ... Or so I thought. We weren't expecting fireworks or confetti. But we also weren't expecting the HOA drama that was about to unfold. I mean, we'd barely gotten our boxers out of the truck when we met Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood. Now, I've heard a lot about Karens online, but nothing could have prepared me for this encounter. She was the kind of neighbor who didn't just know every rule in the HOA handbook. She wrote them. Karen appeared out of nowhere, like a suburban superhero, except instead of saving the day, she had a clipboard, a scowl, and the type of energy that made you question whether you'd broken a rule just by existing. "Excuse me? You can't park that truck there," she called out, her voice high-pitched and brimming with authority. I looked at her, a bit confused. We'd just parked in front of the house. It wasn't blocking anyone's driveway. The truck was parked perfectly. But it didn't matter. Apparently, Karen had a different idea of what perfect was. According to HOA regulations, she started, almost like a broken record. "You're supposed to park in the designated area. Right there." She pointed to the curb at the far end of the block, as if it was the holy grail of parking spots. I was about to say something, but my wife, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward. She didn't look rattled. In fact, she looked way too calm for the situation at hand. I could see her jaw clench just a little, like she was on the verge of saying something that could either de-escalate the situation or set it on fire. But then, she did something I wasn't expecting. Without a word, she reached into her bag, pulled out her military ID, and held it up for Karen to see. Now, here's where things took an interesting turn. Because I swear, it was like Karen saw a ghost. Her eyes went wide, her mouth dropped open, just enough to catch flies, and she froze. Complete deer in headlights moment. You could almost hear the sound of a record scratching in the background. For a brief second, I thought maybe Karen was going to apologize for being a stickler about parking. You know, a nice little sorry about that. I got a little carried away. But no. Instead, her eyes darted between my wife's ID and her clipboard, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. And I knew right away that the game had changed. See, my wife wasn't just any regular civilian. She was a military veteran, and something told me Karen had no idea what she'd just stumbled into. I mean, Karen had probably spent her whole life enforcing rules about things like lawn ornaments and mailbox height. But the woman she was facing now, she'd been through far tougher situations than arguing over parking spots. She'd served in ways that Karen, and most people, could never understand. I watched as Karen's posture went from confident rule enforcer to full-blown confusion. I almost expected her to start stammering, but instead, she went completely silent. For a second, there was a moment of pure, awkward stillness between the three of us, like the calm before the storm. And trust me, Karen had no idea just how big a storm she'd just walked into. What happened next would be something that Karen would never forget. But that's a story for another time. Stick around. It's a story you're not going to want to miss. And if you enjoyed this one, be sure to click subscribe, because tomorrow, we have another special story for you. Asterisk, it's funny how quickly things can go from, hey, I think this is going to be a great neighborhood, to, oh, this is definitely going to be a pain in the ass. You'd think, moving into a peaceful suburban area, that you'd encounter friendly neighbors, maybe the occasional bake sale, and, if you're lucky, a random chat at the mailbox. But no, that's not how it worked out for us. It started innocently enough. We were unloading boxes when Karen appeared again, as if she had an internal radar that went off every time something slightly deviated from her version of perfect. This time, it wasn't parking. Oh no, Karen had moved on to more pressing issues. This time, she had a problem with our packager package. Mind you, that we'd left on the porch while we were getting the rest of the stuff out of the truck. I wasn't sure if she had been keeping track of the package's exact arrival time. But there she was, standing at the bottom of our driveway, like some self-appointed neighborhood sheriff. "You can't just leave packages sitting out like that," she said, her voice dripping with that condescending "I know best" tone. "It's against HOA guidelines to leave items unattended in plain view." I blinked. "It's just a box, Karen. We're not leaving it there forever. We're literally moving in right now." But she wasn't having it. Karen wasn't the type to let logic get in the way of making sure everyone followed the rules to her exact specifications. And as she stood there, glaring at the box like it was a dangerous weapon, I could already see the wheels turning in her head. She wasn't going to let this slide. She was going to make it a thing. "Oh, it's not just a box," she continued, her voice growing more smug. "It's about maintaining a clean and orderly neighborhood. You really should be more careful about these things. I'm going to have to report this." She reached for her phone like she was preparing to dial 911 over a chocolate bar wrapper on the sidewalk. Now, I could have let it go, laughed it off, or just told her to mind her business. But there was something about the way she acted, like she was above everyone else, enforcing rules that no one else seemed to care about, that got under my skin. And besides, I didn't want to be the guy who lets the neighborhood Karen get the upper hand. So, I sighed and turned to my wife, who had been standing in the background, observing the whole spectacle, with the quiet calm of someone who had been through far worse. That's when the tension started to build. Karen was so fixated on the stupid box that she hadn't even noticed my wife's silence. I mean, she wasn't just standing there quietly. No, my wife had that look. The one that said, "I'm about to handle this in a way you won't forget." And I'll be honest, I wasn't sure if Karen was going to come out of this confrontation unscathed, without saying a word. My wife reached into her bag and pulled out something that I'm pretty sure Karen wasn't prepared for: a military ID. Not just any ID, mind you, but one that carried with it the kind of authority and respect that made people stand a little straighter and think twice before pushing someone too far. When Karen saw that military ID, it was like she'd been hit with a cold splash of water. The smug smile faded, replaced with a look of pure shock, like she'd just realized she'd been messing with the wrong person. She stood there, mouth slightly open, trying to process what she'd just seen. For a moment, it was like time had slowed down. The air between us thickened, and the typical suburban lawn suddenly felt a lot smaller. "You," Karen started, her voice faltering. "You're military." My wife nodded once, calmly. "I am." It wasn't just the words that hung in the air, it was the way she said it. No brash declaration, no need for extra flair. Just a quiet assurance that shut down any further attempts at confrontation. It was the kind of power that didn't need to shout to be heard. Karen's brain seemed to stall, the gears grinding as she tried to reconcile her judgmental world with the reality standing before her. But there was no reconciling. She had made the mistake of assuming that the quiet woman standing before her was just some random suburbanite. She had no idea who she was up against. The confusion on Karen's face was almost comical. It was like she had accidentally challenged a black belt in karate and had just realized she was in way over her head. I half expected her to apologize, but I quickly remembered this was Karen. She wasn't about to back down completely. Instead, she went for the next best thing deflection. Well, I didn't know. But still, rules are rules, and my wife's voice cut through Karen's babbling. Rules are fine, but they're not meant to make life harder for people, especially when they've got better things to focus on. That was the turning point. Karen didn't know how to respond. She couldn't argue with military service. She couldn't argue with the calm, collected authority that my wife exuded. And just like that, Karen's bravado melted away, leaving her standing awkwardly on our lawn, like she'd just realized that maybe she wasn't the most important person in the neighborhood anymore. As for me, I couldn't help but feel a little proud. Not just because my wife had handled the situation with grace, but because Karen had finally learned that not everyone can be bossed around. Some people just don't take crap from anyone, especially not from a Karen with a clipboard. It didn't take long for Karen to escalate the situation. You know how some people just can't help but make a scene? Karen was definitely one of those people. Before I could even get the truck unpacked, she had dialed the cops over a package sitting on the porch, which, in her mind, was a violation of some unwritten HOA rule that I'm pretty sure only she knew about. So, naturally, the cops showed up. 2 of them, looking like they were fresh out of a sitcom. The kind of guys you'd expect to see in an episode where the whole town is annoyed over something ridiculously trivial. But they're too nice to outright refuse helping. One officer was tall, with a mustache that looked like it belonged in a 70s cop movie. And the other, shorter one, had that I'm just here for the free donuts vibe. They pulled up in their squad car and, for a brief second, I thought they might roll their eyes when they saw Karen standing there, finger wagging at the box. But nope, they were professionals. Or at least, they were trying to be. "All right, what's going on here?" the mustached officer asked, flipping open his notepad like we were about to get caught in some sort of criminal conspiracy. I glanced at Karen, who was standing there like she'd just solved a murder mystery. "She's violating HOA rules," Karen exclaimed, still pointing at the box like it was the thing that ruined her whole day. "This needs to be dealt with, right away. I have every right to report it." I could already tell where this was going. The police officers exchanged a look, and I could practically hear the unspoken, "Are we really doing this?" floating between them. But instead of laughing it off, they nodded, writing down notes as Karen explained in excruciating detail how the box's existence was a threat to the neighborhood. I didn't even know what to say at this point, so I just stayed quiet, hoping they'd wrap it up fast. My wife, however, wasn't just standing there like I was. She was watching the whole thing unfold with a kind of cool, calm focus that made it clear she wasn't in any rush to intervene. She didn't get upset, didn't raise her voice. She just let Karen ramble on, a small smirk tugging at the corner of her lips as Karen kept digging herself into a deeper hole. Honestly, I could see Karen was starting to lose her grip. She kept repeating the same things over and over, trying to make the cops see how terrible we were for having a package on the porch. The officers, at this point, looked like they just wanted to get back to their coffee break. They asked a few clarifying questions, scribbled a few more notes, and then turned to us. "We'll need to take a look at the package, but it seems like a minor issue," the shorter officer said, clearly wanting to wrap things up. But Karen wasn't done yet. She wasn't backing down. She was going to make sure we were guilty of something, anything. And in that moment, I realized what she was really after: control. She wasn't just annoyed by the box, she wanted to be the one in charge. That's when my wife, who had been standing there silently, finally made her move. Slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out her military ID, holding it up for the officers to see. The look on Karen's face, priceless. It was like she had just seen a ghost or a dragon, maybe. The sudden shift in the atmosphere was almost tangible. 1 second, Karen was ready to keep fighting, and the next, she was frozen. Her face drained of color. The police officers, for a moment, didn't say anything either. The taller one looked at the ID, then looked at Karen, then back at the ID. It was like he was processing something that just didn't quite fit with what Karen had been saying. I could feel the power shift right then and there. My wife, with one simple gesture, had completely altered the course of this interaction. Karen opened her mouth, probably to argue, but nothing came out. Her eyes darted back and forth between my wife and the id, like she was trying to figure out if she was imagining things. You, ... You're military, Karen stammered. Yeah, my wife replied quietly, but with so much strength in her voice that Karen couldn't do anything but stand there. The cops had gone from mildly interested to full and stunned. They weren't used to seeing people just handle themselves like that, especially in the face of someone like Karen, who had clearly been trying to play the authority card. But now the tables had turned. Karen's attempts to reclaim control were crumbling. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands twitched as she grasped for something, anything to say. That could save face. But she couldn't. She had overestimated herself, misjudged who she was up against. The officers exchanged a few more looks, clearly trying to figure out how to gracefully end the situation. Well, the mustached cop said slowly, it looks like everything checks out here. Just, make sure you're following the rules next time, all right? It was a weak attempt to keep Karen from completely losing her mind, but it was enough. Karen, still in shock, nodded without a word and walked away. Her earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the kind of awkwardness that only comes after you've been totally outclassed. I watched her retreat with the kind of satisfaction you get after watching someone who's been too smug for too long finally get their comeuppance. And my wife, she just gave me a small smile, tucked her ID back in her pocket, and turned to me. Another day in the life, she said, her voice light, like this was just another Tuesday for her. For Karen, though, it was a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. The silence that followed Karen's freezing in place could have lasted forever. I'm sure the officers were equally stunned, but I could tell they were trying to keep their composure. After all, it's not every day that an HOA spat turns into a showdown of military credentials and awkwardness. The most surprising part, though, Karen didn't immediately apologize. That might have been too much to expect from someone who'd spent the last 10 minutes practically shaking her finger at us over a misplaced box. Instead, she just stood there, her face flushing as if she'd just been caught red-handed sneaking cookies from the jar. I almost wanted to laugh, but I figured I'd let her stew for a moment. She deserved it. But then my wife did something that made me fall in love with her all over again. She spoke. Up until that point, she'd said very little, letting Karen play out her little drama. I think my wife was just waiting for the right moment, the perfect time to drop a bombshell, with a calmness that only someone who's faced down real danger could have. She finally broke the silence. You've been assuming things about me, Karen, she said, her tone measured but firm. You've been assuming that I'm just some random woman moving into this neighborhood, that I'm someone you can boss around. Karen, still processing what had just happened, opened her mouth to speak, but didn't get the chance. I'm not here to get into a fight with you, Karen, my wife continued, her voice holding an authority that sent a shiver through the air. I'm here to live my life, to be part of this community. But I've served in places where your rules wouldn't matter. I've been to places where property value was the last thing on anyone's mind. I've seen things your HOA probably wouldn't want to hear about. The officers were now on full alert, their attention completely on my wife. I could feel the shift in the air. Suddenly, we weren't just dealing with Karen's overbearing need to control the neighborhood. We were dealing with someone who had lived through much tougher situations than worrying about where to park a truck or whether a package was left out too long. Karen's face turned a shade of red that could rival a tomato. Her earlier bravado, the same smug confidence that had almost made her feel like a neighborhood sheriff, was now nowhere to be seen. She stammered, trying to find her words, but they didn't come. The realization that she had seriously misjudged the situation was sinking in, and it wasn't a pleasant feeling. Military. She finally managed to squeak. You're in the military. My wife nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. I was, and I'm proud of it. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't a boast. It was just a simple statement of fact. And in that moment, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Karen, once the loudest voice in the yard, was suddenly silenced. The two officers, who had been nothing more than passive observers up until that point, were now fully engaged. They looked at each other, exchanging glances, clearly reassessing the situation. I didn't know, Karen muttered, her voice dropping. She was embarrassed, and I could see it on her face. It was the kind of embarrassment that only happens when you realize you've made a massive fool of yourself. But the worst part was that she wasn't ready to admit it. She was too proud to admit she'd crossed the line, but the weight of the moment was already doing that for her. There was a long, uncomfortable pause. The neighborhood, which had been quietly watching from their windows, was now fully tuned in. I could see heads poking out from behind curtains, neighbors whispering to each other. They had been witnessing the exchange between us and Karen, and I could tell they were starting to put two and two together. Karen wasn't the neighborhood's beloved rule enforcer. She was the neighborhood's bully, and she'd just met someone who wasn't afraid of her. The two officers stood by, letting the tension hang in the air like thick fog. Finally, the mustached officer cleared his throat, trying to break the silence. Well, it seems like this is all in order, ma'am. We'll go ahead and mark this as resolved. He gave Karen a polite nod, but his eyes had already lost their earlier neutrality. They had shifted into something more judgmental. I could see the change in the neighborhood too. The neighbors, who had been silently watching the scene unfold, were now looking at Karen with clear disdain. It wasn't just about the box anymore. They had witnessed firsthand how Karen had acted like she was the supreme ruler of the block, calling the cops over trivialities and trying to control every little aspect of everyone's life. But now they saw her for what she really was. And it wasn't pretty. Karen, realizing the ground had shifted beneath her feet, slowly turned and mumbled something about getting back to her duties. She retreated back to her house, looking every bit like a defeated character from a bad sitcom, as she disappeared behind her front door. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My wife and I shared a look, and I could see a spark of pride in her eyes. She wasn't just proud of what she had said. She was proud of how she'd handled herself, how she hadn't let Karen's ridiculous antics rattle her. And as we stood there, surrounded by the quiet murmurs of the neighbors, who had witnessed the entire thing, I realized something important. This wasn't just about a parking violation or a misplaced box. This was about standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. This was about showing that you don't have to be loud to be powerful. And Karen, well, she'd learned that the hard way. After the dust settled, and Karen disappeared behind the safety of her front door, it felt like a weight had lifted. The whole situation, the confrontation, the tension, had taken so much out of us that I wasn't sure whether to laugh or just breathe a sigh of relief. The officers made a few polite comments about keeping the neighborhood peaceful, then quickly left, clearly eager to put this behind them. I don't think they'd signed up to be part of an HOA drama when they became cops. But it wasn't just the police leaving that felt like the end of an era. It was the way the neighborhood felt. All the houses that had been silently watching the scene unfold from behind their curtains or through the blinds suddenly felt like part of the drama. I mean, I could almost hear them thinking, did that just happen? Did she really call the cops on them over a box? My wife stood next to me, her hands relaxed at her sides. She didn't seem shaken or upset. In fact, she looked almost amused. I couldn't help but smile at her. I was proud of her, more than I could say. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't gotten defensive. She'd simply stood her ground, calmly, and without hesitation. And the entire neighborhood and Karen had learned that she wasn't someone to be messed with. It's over, I said, more to myself than to her. But she heard me and nodded. Double quotes, yeah, she said quietly. It is. We took a moment, standing there in the cool evening air, letting the last of the tension drain away. The sun had set, and the street was finally quiet, the kind of silence you only get after a storm. We had our new home, and that was all that mattered now. Over the next few days, something interesting happened. The tension, the awkwardness of that first encounter with Karen, started to fade. It didn't disappear completely. Karen was still the same passive-aggressive neighbor, but the rest of the block began to change. Slowly, we started meeting the people who had been watching us from behind their windows. They started coming over with small gifts, a loaf of banana bread here, a card there, welcoming us to the neighborhood in their own way. It wasn't as grand as the classic new neighbors throwing a housewarming party kind of thing, but it was still nice. They weren't just being polite, either. It was clear that they respected my wife, respected her calm demeanor, her military service. It was like they saw her in a new light, as more than just another face on the block. They saw her as someone who had been through real challenges, someone who didn't buckle under pressure. I remember one conversation with a neighbor down the street, a woman named Linda, who had been one of the first to come over and introduce herself after the Karen incident. She'd heard about what had happened and had a lot to say, though she chose her words carefully. "I've been living here for 15 years, she said, shaking her head, and Karen, she's always been like that, always looking for something to complain about. But after what you did, I've never seen her back off like that before. I think you might have changed the dynamic around here, you know." It was a weird feeling. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we weren't just fitting into the neighborhood. We were starting to become part of it. Not because of how nice our house was, or how tidy our lawn looked, but because of the way we had handled the situation. They saw us as more than just the new people who moved in. They saw us as part of the fabric of the community, and they respected that. It wasn't something that came easily in a place like this, where everyone had their own little space and their own little rules. But it felt good. I think what really resonated with the neighbors was the way my wife had handled herself. She didn't stand there and argue or try to win the confrontation. She didn't even raise her voice. She just let Karen ramble, let her dig herself into a hole, and when the time was right, she revealed who she was, quietly, calmly, but with all the strength in the world, and that's when the power shifted. Karen was left to deal with her own mistake, and we were left with the respect of the people around us, even the officer who had been the most skeptical of the whole situation came by a few days later to check on us. "Hey," he said with a small smile, "I just wanted to apologize. I wasn't sure what to think about the whole thing, but you two handled it like pros. And if Karen causes any more problems, just let us know. I appreciated it. I really did." He didn't need to say anything, but the fact that he came back to make sure we were okay meant something. But then there was Karen. She wasn't completely out of the picture. She still glared at us whenever we passed by her house, and I could tell she was stewing over the whole thing. She probably told herself she'd try harder next time to make us the villains. But deep down, I think she knew she'd lost that battle. What had been a small power struggle turned into a bigger lesson in humility. She wasn't just the HOA enforcer anymore. She was the woman who had tried to run the block, only to meet someone who had bigger things to focus on than her petty rules. In the weeks that followed, The neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. The awkwardness of the initial days of our move faded, and we became part of the community in ways I hadn't expected. We started chatting with neighbors more often, getting invited to weekend barbecues, and even helping out with small neighborhood projects. The respect we'd earned, not just because we had survived the HOA Karen encounter, but because we had done so with grace, made all the difference. Karen still lives down the street, still sticks to her rules, like a stubborn old dog, but something's changed. The other neighbors don't look at her the same way anymore. She's not the undisputed queen of the block, and for the first time since we'd moved in, I didn't feel like we were outsiders. We had earned our place, and that felt better than anything. As for us, life was moving forward. We had our house, we had our peace, and we had each other. My wife had faced down a neighborhood bully with nothing but quiet strength, and in doing so, she had earned the respect of everyone around her, something that, in the long run, meant more than any HOA rulebook could ever dictate. And, frankly, that felt like a win.